Methylene blue tends to split people into two separate camps, not because of what it does, but because of how it's being interpreted. Some people describe a very clear shift, more energy, sharper thinking. Others take the same thing, the same dosage, and feel nothing, something inconsistent even. That contrast is usually treated like a mystery, but it isn't. Most of the conversation stays on the surface: what it does, how to take it, whether or not it works. But that question is already off, because the effect that you feel from a supplement like methylene blue isn't coming from the compound alone. It's coming from the system that it's entering. I'm Dr. Kenny, an IFM certified functional medicine practitioner, and I tend to look at things when it comes to healing through patterns and systems rather than hype, fear, or black and white thinking. When you step back and look at something like methylene blue through this lens, a pattern starts to emerge that you can navigate yourself. What I've found in this conversation is the people who feel a strong effect and the people who feel nothing are often not dealing with the same underlying system state. The difference isn't the compound, it's the individual. It's the context and environment that it's entering. So instead of thinking with the compound, we need to start with the environment it's walking into. Most people approach supplements with a simple expectation. Take this, feel that. More energy, better focus, clearer thinking, and this applies to other supplements as well. That assumption feels reasonable, especially in our conventional paradigm, but it's rarely how the body works. Our physiology does not operate like a light switch. It behaves more like a network where different systems are constantly influencing one another. So when something like methylene blue enters the picture, it's not just triggering a single effect. It's interacting with whatever environment is already there, and even as deep as the cellular level. And that's where the outcomes begin to diverge depending on the person. If your internal environment is more stable and responsive and has resources readily available, you might notice a clear shift. The system can translate the input, like methylene blue, into something that you can also perceive. If your system, however, is already strained or compensating, you might feel less, or at best something inconsistent. Not because nothing is happening necessarily, but because the system isn't responding as cleanly to that input. This is why two people can take the same compound and walk away with completely different experiences. The variation is not random. It is the variation of the human experience. It reflects the different underlying states. And if your response is confusing, this is usually where that confusion lives. Let's talk about why the hype exists as well. There's a reason that methylene blue keeps coming up in conversations around energy and brain function and performance. At a basic level, it's been studied for how it interacts with mitochondrial activity, specifically the processes that your cells use to generate energy. Mitochondria produce ATP. And essentially, this is the usable fuel that powers everything from our physical movement to our mental and emotional clarity. Methylene blue appears to influence how electrons move through that system. It's very detailed chemistry here, but the more efficiently those electrons can move through the system, the more efficiently energy can be produced. And this isn't just theoretical. In human research, low doses of methylene blue have been shown to increase activity in certain brain regions during memory tasks. That tells us something important, that there is a real measurable effect under specific conditions. And if you are one who likes the research, I've included a free research summary in the pinned comment in the description below. It includes a few of the research articles that I used to create this particular video, if you'd like to dive into them yourself. But this is where people usually start to draw oversimplified conclusions when we start to see research headlines. A measurable effect in a population in an incredibly controlled study does not automatically translate into a universal benefit for everyone. It means that the compound has the ability to influence a system that's already in motion. If that system isn't limited in the way the compound is designed to influence the system, the result will likely work well. If your system does not have the limitation of that electron transport in the way that the compound is designed to influence it, the result may be more minimal or very difficult to perceive. When people think about energy, they tend to focus on output alone. How do I produce more? How do I feel more energized? And that framing assumes that energy itself is something that you can simply increase indefinitely. And that's not the case. Energy production is regulated by many different mechanisms throughout the body. And one of those key regulators is oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is essentially the browning of an apple that occurs in our own bodies when we're simply exposed to oxygen. The difference between us and that browning apple is that we have living systems, antioxidant systems, designed to combat this real time. So oxidative stress and the cumulative load there refers to the balance between molecules that create cellular stress and those that neutralize it. Oxidative stress itself is not inherently bad. In fact, those signals in the right amount are important to drive forward resilience and adaptation. But like most things in physiology, it also depends on that balance. This is where methylene blue becomes more specific in its role as well. It interacts with what's called the redox environment. You may recall this from high school or maybe college chemistry. This is basically how your body manages oxidation and reduction. Or in practical terms, this is how your body handles this oxidative stress at the cellular level. If that environment or system is relatively balanced, you might experience a smoother, more efficient energy response throughout life. But if it's already strained or depleted, changing energy flow doesn't necessarily feel like a boost. Sometimes it feels like nothing at all, or like a response that doesn't hold. In human studies, when researchers improved redox balance and glutathione levels, which is a primary antioxidant, in adults, they observed improvements in mitochondrial function and physical strength and cognition. The oxidative environment, when we talk about methylene blue, is not a side detail. It's one of the factors that determines whether or not the system can respond in the first place. Once you understand the context of oxidative stress being part of the equation, a pattern starts to emerge and come more into focus, and the different reactions that people have to methylene blue aren't random. They tend to fall in a few distinct categories. There are people who take it and feel a clear, noticeable shift right away. Energy feels smoother, thinking feels sharper, their recovery's better, their sleep may be better. In those cases, the mechanism of the compound is aligning with a real bottleneck in their system. This constraint in energy production was reduced, and the system could respond accordingly. Then there are the people who feel very little. No meaningful change, no clear signal, and that usually suggests that the process methylene blue is influencing isn't the primary limitation for that person. The compound is active, but it's not addressing what's actually limiting energy output. And then there's the third group, people who feel something at first, but it doesn't hold or it feels incomplete. This is a temporary shift, and that doesn't translate into sustained improvement. That pattern usually points to a deeper constraint as well, like the last one that can't be resolved by improving efficiency alone. What this highlights is something that's commonly misinterpreted today. Resilience and healthy aging aren't driven by a single lever, like energy production alone. They are the result of multiple systems working together at the exact same time. There's another important distinction that rarely gets talked about in these conversations around methylene blue, and that is the difference between efficiency and capacity. Efficiency is how well your system uses what it has access to. Capacity is how much your system has to work with. In the context of mitochondria, that means not just how well they are functioning, but how many you have and how robust their populations are. This matters because improving efficiency in a system that's already depleted only gets you so far. You can make the gears turn more smoothly, but if there aren't enough gears present in the first place, the overall output is still limited. Something can feel better without actually being better. Human research consistently shows that building stronger mitochondrial systems depends on broader inputs, movement, accurate recovery, and adaptation to stressors over time. It's not typically the result of a single compound like methylene blue acting in isolation. So even if something like methylene blue helps the system run more efficiently, it doesn't necessarily mean that your system has the depth to sustain that improvement. At this point, you can see why this conversation is more layered than it first appears. We've already talked about oxidative stress and mitochondrial capacity, and even those two alone can completely change how an individual person responds to this supplement. For many people, that explains their experience not matching their expectations. But of course, they are not the only variables. There's also the nervous system, quite broadly. Whether your body is more stressed or activated or more regulated or adaptable influences how energy is used and perceived. Two people with the same output on paper may experience it very differently depending on how their systems interpret their signals. There's gut health, which plays a role in inflammation and nutrient absorption and the signaling pathways that influence energy metabolism as well. If that layer is disrupted, the downstream effect is often misread as an energy problem. And then there's the question of how something is used over time, which brings in the dosing and cycling question. A response that looks inconsistent is often a system responding differently over time, not randomly, because we are very adaptable and ever-changing beings. These aren't small details to overlook. When we really put all this together and take a big step back, you stop seeing methylene blue as this primary driver of a singular outcome and start seeing it more as something that interacts with our systems and can actually reveal the state of systems that it's interacting with. That shift is subtle, but it changes how you interpret your experience, possibly across other supplements as well. Because the issue for many of us is that we are complex, but that complexity also must be honored. It's not that nothing's working that you're trying, but that multiple systems are slightly off at the same time, and each one is quietly shaping how energy is produced or used or perceived, or other symptoms that arise. That pattern often gets misread as a single problem, isolated, when it's actually the interaction of these several smaller constraints. That's where this conversation around methylene blue naturally expands beyond any single compound. It moves into how mitochondria interact with our health very broadly, from the immune system to energy output to overall resilience. One of the more common questions I get about methylene blue isn't simply about what it is. It's, does it work? And whether or not your response is something that is useful information or something that's just a misread signal. You'll hear people describe very clear effects, sharper focus, better memory, even better sleep quality. And then you'll see someone else who takes the exact same supplement and dose and feels almost nothing. I want to walk you through how I personally use methylene blue, where I've found it useful, and how to interpret your own response in a way that actually reflects what's happening underneath with this systems-based lens. We're moving beyond should I use this or not to more of what happens when I do and what does that tell me. Your response to a supplement like methylene blue or any other isn't random. It reflects the condition of the system that it is entering. This reframe is incredibly useful when it comes to natural healing approaches because most people evaluate a supplement by whether or not they felt something. Supplements work differently. When people do feel a strong response to methylene blue, it tends to show up in a very specific way. It's not just more energy in a general sense. It's often more organized and accessible energy. Focus feels cleaner, like you're burning the premium fuel. And you can stay on a task without as much internal drift and distraction. This is something that I personally experienced, and there's a huge physiological basis for that. In fact, human imaging studies have shown that low doses of methylene blue can increase activity in brain regions involving attention and short-term memory. Essentially, it improves the way your brain's networks are connected and communicating, not just how much energy is available, but how it's being allocated efficiently as well. This energy theme is something I noticed personally when starting methylene blue. This wasn't something I used early on in my healing journey either. I came back to it after spending years working on other systems, including my digestion and my overall resilience and hormonal set points. I've found myself more centered and focused, creating videos or systems or even talking to patients and being extra present. I've even noticed small changes in my sleep recovery data as well as my heart rate variability. These are all clues to me that what it's helped to do is unlock more potential in my energy creation now that I've set the stage and the tone in my systems to be able to receive the signal of methylene blue. But that clarity and free flow piece is often what tends to mislead people as well, because feeling a benefit is often taken as proof of what was missing, my low energy being a methylene blue deficiency. But that's not exactly what that response is truly showing us. Probably heard this in other areas before. When something helps, it must be the thing that your body needed. A strong response does not necessarily confirm a root cause. It confirms that your system was simply able to respond, and those are not the same thing. A little nuance here. In many cases, a compound like methylene blue is interacting with a part of your physiology that's already responsive and amplifies that signal. So it feels like progress perhaps, but maybe the underlying constraint hasn't been addressed. That improvement tends to be limited or situational or dependent on continuing the same input. And this just creates dependency. That's not the goal with deep root cause healing. In part 1, we also talked about 3 general responses to methylene blue: the clear shift, the minimal response, or the incomplete one that doesn't stick. What I want to focus on is what those patterns point to clinically as well, because that's where this becomes more actionable. If your response is clear and clean, this usually tells me that there's already a decent foundation in place. The system had enough stability to translate that input of the methylene blue into something usable that you could perceive. That's useful information, not because the compound itself is the answer, but because it suggests your system is able to burn that energy cleanly. It's in a position to respond to these targeted inputs. If you felt very little, that's not a failure of methylene blue or your systems. It usually means the pathway being influenced by methylene blue isn't the primary bottleneck as to why your energy is particularly drained. Something else upstream or underneath is what's driving your fatigue. And until that's addressed, efficiency level tools won't manage that meaningfully. And if you felt something but it didn't hold, that's usually the most revealing pattern that we're living between these two experiences. It suggests that your system is responsive enough to shift, but it doesn't have the reserve to sustain it. And there may be other underlying factors at play. It usually points to foundational inputs like movement, adequate recovery, and stress regulation needing more consistency before something like methylene blue can do its most efficient job. This is the distinction that frames the way I think about timing with these tools. When I first encountered methylene blue, I didn't have the foundation personally to use it well. And this is something I had already worked with theoretically. The system it would have been entering wasn't ready for that kind of input. I needed to spend more dedicated time on the layers that are required to remove any roadblocks in our energy production chemistry. And this includes gut health and function, or stress chemistry and nervous system regulation, even sleep quality architecture. And this is the type of theory that I apply to my patients as well. This distinction, when it comes to natural healing and supporting longevity as well, matters more than most people realize. When something is used as leverage or a healing tool, it builds on what's already present and working underneath. If you've tried something that should have worked, but it didn't, this is usually part of that explanation. It's not that the tool itself was inherently wrong. It's that the timing didn't match the readiness of the system. So here's what my actual use looks like. Not as a protocol recommendation, because there's really no one size fits all to natural healing and longevity, but as context for how I think about fit. I personally use methylene blue in low doses in a capsulated form intermittently. It's not a daily experience. It's not as a foundational tool either. It sits on top of everything else after sleep, stress regulation, healthy boundaries, movement, and nutrition. Those are all dialed in. Not perfect, but the foundation is there. I tend to use it most on days where sustained energy output, especially my cognitive output, matters most. On my complex patient days, strategic planning for the business, or even YouTube scripting and content creation. And I don't use it as a crutch, but really as a tool for refinement and optimization. The base is there, and ultimately this is a tool to use to get me to the next level. And another important thing is that I do cycle it. We'll talk more about dosing strategies in a future video in this series, but this is one of the things that gets missed in these conversations around supplements in general. Our systems do have the potential to adapt to consistent inputs over time, and of course we want to prevent that from stifling any consistent benefit over time. This kind of self-monitoring and tuning into oneself is also where the real value of natural healing and supplementation often lives. It's not in the compound itself. It's learning to read how your system responds and what it's telling you through this process. Once you look at methylene blue this way, or really any supplement, it's difficult to see them the same way. You're no longer asking whether or not it simply worked. You're looking at what the response is showing you, especially in your systems underneath and over time. If you've been evaluating this experience as a pass-fail experience, this is where the value of the nuance breaks down. The response itself isn't a simple black and white conclusion, it is information to iterate on. When it comes to methylene blue, the most important variable isn't whether or not someone takes it, it's how it's used. Because this is one of those compounds where context matters more than almost anything else when we talk about dosing strategies. And a lot of the confusion around it comes from people collapsing very different use cases into a single conversation. You'll see ranges and protocols and strong opinions along the way, but they're often pulled from completely different settings and applied as if they mean the same thing for everyone. And my goal here isn't to give you a protocol. It's to help you understand how to think about dosing and safety in a way that actually respects how this compound behaves in each person's unique body. So we'll walk through what factors actually matter and what tends to influence how people respond to methylene blue and where oversimplification and black and white thinking can create problems. All right, so let's start where the confusion usually begins. If you search methylene blue dosing in a Google search, you're probably going to run into a range that looks something like 0.5 to 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. That's what gets used in emergency room settings for things like cyanide poisoning, for instance. What sometimes happens is people see that range and they do the math for their own body weight and start to apply that logic to the capsular or oral forms that are ordered online. And that's a big error, not because their math is wrong in any way, but because the context is completely different when we talk about oral versus IV routes. And it enters the bloodstream at its full concentration in a controlled clinical setting. When you take an oral dose of methylene blue for any of the longevity or mitochondrial focused uses, it has to transit the entire digestive tract. Some of it gets absorbed, and the absorption rate in the gut is actually quite high at about 80 to 90% for most people, if their gut is functioning well. It's a fundamentally different experience for your entire system. The context of the delivery still changes everything about how the compound behaves, and that's very important to remember. So beyond just the dose size and the route, there's another issue to consider with dosing strategies, like caffeine even. The more you put in, the more you're supposed to get out of it. So if 5 milligrams in a compounded form gives me a little clarity, then 20 milligrams should give me 4 times the clarity. That's not how this and many other compounds work in the body when it comes to our chemistry. Methylene blue, rather than thinking of it as a single energy input, should be reframed as an efficiency modulator. It interacts with the way that your mitochondria move electrons around to ultimately create energy, and it does this at quite low doses. It's just supporting the machinery that's already there. But a key thing to remember is that your capacity is determined by many factors: gut health, hormones, mitochondrial populations. So if your mitochondrial populations are compromised or low or less efficient for other reasons, then adding more of an efficiency modulator on top of that doesn't necessarily solve the problem that's creating energy roadblocks to begin with. Doing so would be like updating the entire wiring system of your house without having enough energy or power even coming in from the supplier. The wiring improvement happens and is real, but it doesn't necessarily change the supply or the total output in the end. So a deeper question when it comes to dosing strategies isn't always just how much should I take, it's can your system actually use what you're giving it? And this is where, for some people, increasing the dose can actually backfire. This brings us to one of the most important concepts in both pharmacology and one of my favorites in functional medicine that almost nobody in this space is talking about: hormesis. This is a word that's used to describe the body's experience of essentially stress chemistry or body burden of different inputs. Small inputs like small doses of methylene blue can support the system, while larger doses can actually put a little pressure, or even the opposite, have detrimental effects on the system. Recent research in 2023 actually confirms this, where researchers gave methylene blue intravenously to both humans and rats, and they were fully expecting to see an increase of brain energy output. More compound, more metabolic activity was the idea, but that's not what happened. Both of the doses they tested actually reduced the blood flow in the brain and the way oxygen was being utilized, which translates to energy production. So this was contrary to the researchers' original hypothesis: more is more. So when we translate this to real-world experience, it often makes sense. When someone takes methylene blue at a higher dose and feels worse, maybe more anxious, or like it's taking more exertion to get the same things done, even elevated heart rate and being more agitated in general, the instinct is usually to assume that they need to adjust the dosing and take more, push through it. That's almost always the wrong move in dosing strategies. The hormetic curve means that you've probably moved past the point where the compound is giving it more efficiency benefits to the system, and you've entered the range more where it's creating additional pressure on your metabolism and your energy production. All right, so there is a number here, sort of. Research recently from 2020 looked at what happens when you give methylene blue to mice at different doses and different levels over several weeks. We'll talk more about this in part 4, but at lower doses, the gut microbiome stayed largely intact, and the gut-brain, or the cognitive performance, also improved. At higher doses, however, they saw shifts in the microbiome that were significant, and those cognitive gains actually disappeared. The general boundary that keeps showing up in the literature for the upper limit of methylene blue dosing is somewhere around 30 milligrams. This is the oral form, by the way. In theory, below that, microbiome disruption is unlikely, but above it, some of the variables start to come into play for how the gut then influences the brain. Just remember that when it comes to this early emerging research, that threshold is just a signal boundary, not necessarily a hard, fast rule. And you may have to go lower even. It just tells you where a hypothetical risk profile starts to tip the scales into being riskier. It definitely doesn't tell you what the right dose is for your body and your context. Because even that threshold isn't the most important variable when it comes to methylene blue dosing strategies. Here's where this gets really practical if you're wondering about this yourself. Most people interpret their response to methylene blue through our current lens, our current paradigm. If they feel nothing, they assume that the dose is too low. If they feel something negative, they assume that they need to adjust and that it's too high. And if they feel good some days and not other days, they assume that the product itself is inconsistent. All three of these circumstances are treating the response to methylene blue as feedback about the dose itself. But what if the response is actually feedback about your systems, not the methylene blue itself? Another recent study from 2022 illustrates this perfectly. Low-dose methylene blue preserved the mitochondrial enzyme function and its activity, and it prevented memory impairment. Again, this is in rats because we don't have a ton of human research on methylene blue for these usages. But what they found here was that the mechanism itself was not additive. It didn't compound. The methylene blue didn't just create new energy. It preserved the system's existing ability to function. And that's a huge distinction, as with many supplements. But methylene blue can support a system that already has the capacity to respond. But if the capacity isn't there, poor mitochondrial health, poor metabolic function and supplies available, or the overall load on your systems and the cumulative stress burden is too high, that compound can't necessarily override that limitation of the systems. So when it comes to dosing, what does a reasonable approach actually look like? And I want to be clear, this is not a protocol, but a way of thinking. This is general context based on some of the best available research as well as clinical observation. Most people who are using methylene blue orally for cognitive or energy and mitochondrial support are working in a range between 2 and 20 milligrams per day. Some of the most interesting anecdotal reports that I've also seen are from some of my older adult patients who are using it for memory support. And they're using it in small amounts at 2 to 3 milligrams per day, on the lower end of that range. The general approach that makes sense for many people is start low and go slow. Pay attention to how you respond and give it some time. If it's not working and you're not feeling the way you think you should feel, perhaps that's time to ask different questions about the systems in addition to wondering about your dosing. Timing matters as well. Methylene blue has a half-life of roughly 5 to 7 hours, and many people find it quite activating. So taking it in the morning is often the most helpful. Taking it before a workout or a heavy exertional period or later in the evening can potentially disrupt heart rate, blood pressure, and even your sleep quality. So be mindful of that. And the cycling question is important as well. Taking breaks is generally a reasonable practice when it comes to this and many other nutritional and longevity supplements. Methylene blue doesn't have a documented tolerance or withdrawal type effect, which is usual, but periodic breaks still make sense when it comes to supplementation broadly. The safest use of something, if there's one thing you can take away, is that this starts with understanding your system. Is it ready for something like methylene blue? Do you have the rest of the inputs dialed in for energy production that are required to make that efficiency tool run it more effectively? And this brings us back to a core point. The dosing confusion around methylene blue isn't always about the number. It's about a thinking and a perspective error. We're asking deeper questions here when it works or when it doesn't. One of the most overlooked questions when it comes to taking methylene blue has nothing to do with energy, focus, or even brain health. It has to do with the gut microbiome. Because anytime you're working with something that demonstrates antimicrobial properties, there's always a second layer to consider. Not just what benefits it may bring, but also what else it might be shifting behind the scenes. So what I want to do here is zoom in on that specific question. What do we currently understand about how methylene blue interacts with the gut microbiome, and how to think about that without oversimplifying it and allowing it the space to breathe? If you've been following along with this methylene blue series, you know that methylene blue interacts with mitochondrial function. It can support electron transport, which ultimately creates our energy. But it's mostly used as an efficiency tool, not something that just powers through the chemistry and other roadblocks. At the right dose, in the right context, it can help the system run more efficiently. But this is a part that rarely gets the same attention because we're so focused on the benefits and the black and white thinking. It was originally used to treat malaria, in fact. That antimicrobial profile is part of why we need to talk about its effects in the gut. Because when you take something that has this broad spectrum killing property, it doesn't just go straight to your mitochondria. It transits the entire digestive tract and interacts there first. And along the way, it's interacting with these species in your gut, both good and bad. This isn't necessarily a reason to panic or anything like that. I want to be clear, but it is a reason to think more carefully than most people are thinking about these kinds of supplements right now. The gut microbiome isn't just a collection of bacteria. There's also fungi and viruses and protozoa involved. It's also a communication network. It talks to our own immune systems and our nervous systems, and it talks directly to the brain in a two-way street via the vagus nerve. It's also a huge hub and center for anti-inflammatory and immune function throughout the whole body. When you shift that environment in a big way, you're not just changing what happens in the gut itself, you're shifting all of its downstream functions as well. And that's where this conversation deserves a little of the air. Let's get clear what we mean by general antimicrobial properties too. A recent comprehensive review from a study in 2021 documented methylene blue's broad pharmacological profile. It demonstrated that this compound has multiple effects against microorganisms, including bacteria, viruses, and protozoan or parasites. And that's not a side effect, that is a core feature of how methylene blue actually functions. That antimicrobial piece and side effects in general are often treated as footnotes in this society, something to be aware of, but not something to fully consider when making these decisions. In good functional medicine, that's not how we evaluate interventions. So the question does turn to how is the individual's microbiome functioning currently before we intervene? It's central to the conversation. And to be clear, this isn't about methylene blue necessarily destroying your gut health and your microbiome. The dose matters enormously, which we covered in part 3. And the mechanism is real, however, so it is important to consider in each individual case. We also might look at other things like antioxidant capacity, because driving more energy production creates more oxidative stress indirectly as well. Here's where the research starts to get a little more interesting and to the human study level. And this is where nuance matters a lot as well. A recent study in 2021 looked at 3 different compounds, methylene blue is one of them, and their effects on both cognitive function and the gut microbiome. What they found was an interesting trend and trade-off. Methylene blue improved memory, it enhanced mitochondrial quality, and the way the brain was working through something called the NRF2 pathway. This basically strengthens your antioxidant systems at the cellular level. That's a meaningful benefit, but at the same time, methylene blue had a noticeable difference on decreasing gut microbiome diversity. But the part that really caught my attention was that the cognitive improvements actually correlated with specific bacterial species that were shifting, meaning that the gut-brain connection, again, is playing out here in real life. So just think about that maybe a different way. The compound that improved one end of the gut-brain axis simultaneously shifted the other end. And that's not a simple good or bad story. This is a systems question about how all of these things are so deeply connected. And that's exactly the type of conversation that gets missed when we stay at the level of the conversation of does methylene blue help with brain fog? It's just not complex enough. The answer might be yes, superficially and published in the research, but the cost might be changes in your microbial environment that you won't notice immediately, but perhaps over time matters. Now, to also be very clear and transparent about something is that there are no current human clinical trials that evaluate methylene blue directly to the human gut microbiome, and it's set up that way from the beginning. That research hasn't been done yet, and that's important context, but we can still look at trends and patterns in other studies that give us clues in secondary measures. There was another systematic review published in 2018 that compiled data from multiple human studies using oral methylene blue for the treatment of malaria. Across those trials, GI symptoms like nausea and vomiting or abdominal discomfort were among the most consistently reported side effects, especially at the higher dosages. And this is perhaps giving us a clue into the shifts in the microbiome. And it's important to note that GI symptoms alone do not prove microbiome disruption, but they do tell us that the gut is responding in some way, whether inflammatory or microbiome shifts or similar. It's definitely registering the compound, and when you combine that with the clinical signal, with the antimicrobial properties that we discussed already that methylene blue has, and with the microbiome diversity data from some of the other studies, a pattern starts to form. So the question becomes, how much is the gut possibly affected by methylene blue, and at what dose does that effect start to matter, especially clinically? And right now, we just don't have a very precise answer to that. We have signals, we have clues, and we have a reasonable extrapolation of that data that we can then apply to the individual. If this kind of honesty and nuance is refreshing to you, that's actually the point of this channel. Please hit the like button if you're enjoying it. Help this message reach more of the right people. In part 3, we talked a little bit about the general threshold for 30 milligrams per day when it comes to oral dosing of methylene blue. Below that 30 milligram number, the significant microbiome disruption appears unlikely based on currently available data. But again, it's not black and white. And above that, the risk profile does seem to increase. But here's where I want to add a layer that I didn't go into in part 3. That threshold is based on an observable disruption. What it doesn't truly account for is some of the subtler changes, the shifts that researchers describe as within 1% in many research articles. In functional medicine, we do pay attention to and give weight to those signals when practiced fully, not because they're alarming or driving specific symptoms, but because over time, small shifts matter. Trends matter most, especially if someone is already dealing with some kind of a compromised gut function, whether we're talking absorption or the microbiome or digestive power. So the practical question becomes, if you're considering or are currently using methylene blue at a low dose and your gut is in good shape, the risk is probably quite low. But if you're experiencing dysbiosis or acid reflux or a system that is under pressure along the digestive tract, adding in an extra antimicrobial compound to an already stressed out microbial environment is a different proposition altogether than adding it to a more resilient digestive system. So where does this leave you if you're considering this? First, this is not meant to be an argument for or against methylene blue necessarily. The cognitive and mitochondrial benefits are very real and very well documented. This is an argument more for using it with your eyes open, understanding context, and a new layer of detail that maybe you haven't explored before. A second important piece is that dosing matters more than most people appreciate. And third, probably most important and a huge central theme to this channel, is that context matters. Your baseline gut health, your microbial diversity, your immune integrity and inflammatory integrity in the gut, all of these factors combine into how well you might utilize methylene blue. Two people taking the same dose can have dramatically different gut environments and have dramatically different effects as well. And fourth is that if you're using methylene blue or even other supplements longer term, it's worth paying attention to these kinds of trends. Not to be fearful, again, but in an informed way, something that gives you a little more sense of the decision-making and empowerment in the process. This is what systems thinking looks like in practice. You can't evaluate a compound by looking at one system and its effects in isolation. The brain benefits are real, but the gut interactions are also likely real. Both of these things can coexist, and the quality of your decision depends on holding both at the same time in your individual context. And again, that principle does not just apply to methylene blue. It applies to almost every intervention that touches your biology. The question is never just, does it work? It's, what else is it doing? And does my system have the capacity to handle both sides of that equation? If you want to understand why the gut-brain connection matters more than most people realize, a good place to start is in this next video here, where I go over how gut health impacts your clarity and your performance and beyond. And this connects to everything that we've been unpacking in this series and what sometimes drives people to methylene blue in the first place. I'm Dr. Kenny, Root Cause Health Detective. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.